There was an enormous football-shaped glowing object hovering a very short distance above the ground.
It got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the next thing we knew it was right over us, And the light was so bright, and then it stopped at treetop level.
I thought it was doomsday. I really did. I didn't know what to expect after seeing two more in the field across from my house. I didn't know if it was an invasion or what.
A hatch opened up from the underside of the craft. A tube came down, and a platform slid down. So this being comes down and walks over to the front of the patrol car.
They were bald, no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and no earlobes, no ear, we could say. Very large eyes, very small flat nose, thin slit for mouth.
I saw this thing and I just came unglued.
Since 1947, thousands of people around the world have become more and more aware of a bizarre phenomenon we have come to know as unidentified flying objects. UFO encounters have been reported by citizens in all walks of life, including the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter.
There were about 20 of us standing outside of a little restaurant, I believe, a high school lunchroom, and a kind of a green light appeared in the western sky. This was right after sundown, and it got brighter and brighter, and then eventually it disappeared. It was didn't have any solid substance to it. It was just a very peculiar-looking light. None of us could understand what it was. I've never made fun of people who've seen other things of that kind.
Years have passed since the widespread UFO sightings of the post-World War II era, and yet the phenomenon is still very much with us. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, acknowledged to be the world's foremost authority on UFOs, has been investigating this enigma since 1948 as a consultant to the Air Force, and since 1973 as the founder and director of the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois. Investigative Research Associates has been proud to have Dr. Hynek direct this project to prepare the first completely factual documentary on UFOs.
The UFO phenomenon is truly a phenomenon of our times. It is an extremely puzzling one and calls forth a wide spectrum of opinions. No matter what one may think about UFOs, no matter what one may believe about them, whether it is all nonsense or whether they represent something very, very real, three facts stand out, three facts which no one can deny. The first is that UFO reports exist. Secondly, that UFO reports come from all over the world. And the third is that many are made by highly responsible people, often scientifically trained. We scientists have no positive proof yet of the origin or even of the reality of these strange reported craft, but we do know that the reports themselves are very real. To find the answer to this magnificent scientific puzzle, the UFO phenomenon, we need to approach it with a truly open mind so we can explore all possible avenues of explanation. This record will allow you to hear the actual witnesses describe their UFO encounters, to listen to the experts give their opinions, and to explain their hypotheses, and to allow you to make your own decision. In the final analysis, you must be the judge. Are we alone?
UFO sightings can be traced to biblical times, at least according to some interpretations of the writings of the prophet Ezekiel and his flying wheel. Ancient cave drawings of strange flying craft have been discovered by archaeologists. Rumors and legends of UFOs persisted throughout the Middle Ages, and the famous 18th century poet Goethe even included a report of his personal UFO sighting in his autobiography. Waves of UFO sightings were reported in the press during the latter 19th and early 20th centuries, but few have taken the phenomenon seriously. The first official United States investigation of UFOs began in 1943, when World War II pilots began relating tales of fiery objects in the night sky, moving at tremendous speeds, even pacing their own aircraft for miles. Military flyers in the European theater termed them Foofighters, foo being the French word for fire. Now retired Air Force Major Paul Duich describes an encounter his crew had over Japan.
The particular one that my crew saw was an orange-red color, and it paced our aircraft for miles and miles off the left horizontal stabilizer. We don't know how far off. It's very difficult to determine. This was a night raid. Everything was blackness all around us. except the fires burning down below. And we were on a bomb run into Sasebo, Japan. And so the top gunner, who had control of all the guns in the back of this B-29 bomber, fired a burst. The tracers were seen to go directly toward it, but nothing happened. And then after a short period of time, this thing detached itself from the position it held and made a kind of a diving, sweeping movement, which took it under our aircraft and off to the right and forward so that we up front could see it. And it's at that time that I saw it. And it was just a big blob of, in terms today, we'd probably call it ionized gas. It ran shivers up and down our spines. We thought it was a Japanese secret device, probably developed by the Germans. And I might add that the fellows over in the European theater thought it was a German device, and the Germans thought it was an Allied secret weapon, and everybody thought it was somebody else's. No one knew what it was.
Post-war conferences confirmed the mystery of the Foofighters. They were no one's secret weapon. The first of several waves of UFO sightings by the general public began in Sweden during the summer of 1946. On June 24, 1947, an experienced search and rescue pilot named Kenneth Arnold took off from a small airstrip in Chehalis, Washington, on a search for the wreckage of a missing C-46 military transport plane said to have gone down in the rough terrain of Mount Rainier with 32 Marines on board.
I had reached the altitude of about 9,200 feet when a very brilliant flash lit the sky around me and actually lit up the airplane that I was flying. And I could see way off to the right, coming in the vicinity of Mount Baker, a whole chain-like string of aircraft coming at a tremendous speed. I could see plainly that they didn't have any tails. I had never seen aircraft of that kind. And I made a quick judgment that they must be approximately 100 foot in their wingspan. And the first unit or first craft flew at a higher altitude than the last. And of course, this is completely reversed from our normal flight patterns. I had a good fix with Mount Adams, and I thought I'd try to clock their speed between Mount Rainier and Mount Adams. Pretty soon they approached Mount Adams. I got a good look at them. One particularly, the second from the last one, seemed a little larger and had a definite wraith-like shape, though, however, when they were flashing and flipping, they seemed circular. But as they left the southernmost ridge of Mount Adams, I looked at my sweep second hand, and they had covered that distance, which is approximately 50 miles, in 1 minute and 42 seconds.
Arnold calculated the speed of the craft at an astounding 1,700 miles per hour. He abandoned his search for the military wreckage and flew on to Pendleton, Oregon, where he reported what he had seen to the Air Force. Arnold didn't think the objects he had seen were extraterrestrial craft, despite press accounts which labeled them as such. Ironically, however, it was Arnold himself who was responsible for the development of the two words which are still used to describe the phenomenon.
Bill Brichette, who was a United Press reporter, he asked me, he said, well, how did they fly? And so I told him, I says, well, they flew very erratically, like boats on rough water, or I said, they would skip and sail and give off these flashes. And I said, or they could fly, I could say maybe you take a saucer and you skip it across the water, and it's erratic. And this is how the name Flying Saucer was born. However, I did not say they were saucer-shaped.
The spectacular Arnold sighting and thousands of subsequent UFO reports led the Central Intelligence Agency to convene a top-secret scientific panel chaired by Dr. H.P. Robertson, noted scientist and relativity expert. The Robertson panel's conclusion? That UFO reports were more dangerous to national security than the unlikely existence of purported extraterrestrial craft. The findings of the Robertson panel greatly influenced the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was created to make official probes into UFO incidents. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was Blue Book's scientific advisor.
Project Blue Book largely operated under the theorem, you might say. It can't be, therefore it isn't. They would, for instance, talk about certain cases being possible balloons, possible aircraft, possible stars. And at the end, when they made up the statistics at the end of the year, all those little words of possible and probable were dropped. But never once did they call a case a possible or probable UFO. There couldn't be such things as UFOs, therefore there couldn't be a possible UFO. Despite that, there were nearly 700 cases which remained unexplained.
Colonel Robert Friend, who directed Project Blue Book from 1958 to 1963, has this to add.
I believe that there is room for further pursuit. While I was conducting that program, I guess that I thought constantly of what I should do in investigating, or exactly how I should react, for instance, if I was to come, say, face to face with some being. I wouldn't really know how to act. And the other thing is that when I read today where people say that, there's no evidence, okay? And that doesn't necessarily mean that there was not evidence there. What it means is that those of us who investigated the things may not have had what it took at that time to recognize it.
In 1966, the government set up a Blue Ribbon Scientific Committee to study the enigma. 2 years later, its chairman, Dr. Edward Condon, professor of physics at the University of Colorado, issued his summary stating that UFOs merited no further governmental attention. This despite the fact that the Condon report itself failed to explain more than a quarter of the cases it examined. Nevertheless, that study led to the official termination of government involvement in UFO research. By far the most sensational UFO incidents are those known as close encounter cases. Dr. Hynek has divided them into 3 categories.
Close encounters of the first kind are close, sufficiently close, say about 500 feet or less, sometimes very much less, so close that there's no question about the person seeing details on it, the portholes or lights or markings or protrusions. In other words, so that there's virtually no chance of a close encounter having been the result of seeing Venus or seeing a twinkling star.
On a clear, warm summer night, just north of Los Angeles, in the small community of Simi Valley, California, police officer Melvin Stewart was casually patrolling in his cruiser. It was Saturday evening, August 13th, 1977. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when Officer Stewart's attention was caught by a strange light in the still darkening sky.
I was on patrol, working as a plainclothes unit, which is a non-marked car. And about 9 o'clock, or around about that time, I observed what appeared to be an aircraft having problems coming towards me. I was driving eastbound on Los Angeles Avenue, and I observed what appeared to be an aircraft having problems dropping fiery, like molten metal or whatever from it, and the molten metal was dissipating, the heat was dissipating before it hit the ground. There was a lot of light coming from, almost like an aircraft landing light. I didn't see any marking lights on it, but just a bright light and then this orangey flame. And then it lost sight of it, as if it crashed. And I put a broadcast out to the possible aircraft down in the area of the Simi Valley Airport. We checked the area and found nothing.
Almost simultaneously, Simi Valley Administrative Assistant Bob Hunt was driving in his car.
We were coming home from dinner over in the San Fernando Valley and coming on the Simi Valley Freeway and reached the crest, which is the county line right at the top, and noticed what I thought to be an airplane in the top left-hand corner of the windshield. Had blue and red lights, which was pretty common for an aircraft, and I really didn't pay all that much attention to it, feeling that it was that, and was continue the conversation with the people I had in the car. And as it reached about the middle of what was our windshield, I noticed that it dropped dramatically. Now, I can't really say how far it dropped, but I know it went from approximately the top of the windshield to the bottom of it in a matter of, faster than you could blink an eye. And at the bottom, when it dropped like it did, it suddenly did an unusual loop at the bottom. And that obviously, coupled with the drop, caught my attention. It seemed to hover for a matter of maybe 1 or 2 seconds. and then was out of sight within 2 or 3 seconds, which was a lot faster than it had been traveling originally. And that right there made me cause to stop and think perhaps it was not an aircraft after all.
Nearly an hour later, 2 police cars were dispatched to investigate reports of an unusual object hovering less than 200 feet over the intersection of Los Angeles Avenue and Airedale Street. A short chase ensued to the freeway interchange, at which time other police officers arrived on the scene, including policewoman Linda Nesbitt.
The UFO, once it reached the area of 118, which is a freeway, and 1st Street, it ascended. And it did so with great speed, more than you would envision the norm. And it remained stationary for great periods of time, longer than I would ever envision a helicopter or anything of that nature staying stationary. We were using our red lights and our aircraft landing lights, which is a spotlight, and pointing them or directing them at the UFO. And it was reacting to it audibly on occasion, and it did make a movement towards the lights. As we turned the light off, then it would return to its original position and remain stationary again. But it was reactive to the lights, which seemed unusual to me.
Minutes later, Officer Stewart arrived and confirmed that it was the same object he had seen earlier. Officer Nesbitt remembers the sound the craft made as it moved overhead.
It wasn't a whoosh or anything like that. It was, I guess you would have to describe it as kind of a hum, beepy, like the conventional noises that you would associate with a craft in a movie. Really it was. That's the kind of noise it was. But it was very distant.
September 9th is a date Bill Pecha will never forget. It's his wife Linda's birthday, and September 9th, 1976 was the day of Bill Pecha's close encounter with a UFO. The Pechas live on a farm just outside Colusa, California, about 100 miles north of San Francisco. That evening, Bill had been up late, having come home from town after buying Linda a birthday present, and then doing some welding in the auto shop behind his house. Around 11 o'clock, Bill went inside to watch the late movie on television. The TV Western was interrupted by an experience even stranger than fiction.
I was watching this Western movie, and the TV really messed up, and then it went out. So I was laying on the couch there, and I looked out the window of the shop to see if the nightlight was on, and it wasn't. So I thought maybe I might have blown a fuse in the shop. So I was going to just go out and check things out until I went out the door, and I felt quite a bit of electrical shock, a tingle. And I looked up, and this is when I seen the huge object above my house and over parts of the barn. I judged it to be at least 150 feet across it. It was saucer-shaped with a high dome. It was very shiny underneath. It was a porcelain-type finish. And I was getting a tremendous shock all over my whole body. My hair was standing up, and I had electrical static feeling over my hair on my arms and my head. And as it moved out over the field, I could start seeing more portions of the top half, which was dome-shaped, and concaves on the side of the dome, sort of like a lemon squeezer. And as it went out over the field very quietly, which is probably about 50 feet off the ground, I spotted 2 more in the distance on power lines. Apparently, to me, that looked like they were absorbing electricity of some way, because there was brilliant red lights with a purplish light in the center of it, a jerky sort of a light coming back. Looked like it was going back to the ship, like they were drawing energy from the power lines. I thought it was doomsday. I really did. I didn't know what to expect after seeing 2 more in the field across from my house. I didn't know if it was an invasion or what.
When the object slowly moved away, Pecha raced back into the house to wake his family, hoping to get them away before it came back. Linda Pecha tells of the frantic activities that followed.
He was standing at the doorway screaming at me to get up. We got to get out of here. It's going to get us. And so I got up and I came down the hallway. The window shade was down. He pulled it back and he told me to look. And I looked out there and it was pitch black when I first looked. And by now he's got a hold of me and he's shaking me and he's screaming at me, which Bill doesn't scream. I mean, he's just hysterical is the way I can explain the way he was. And he keeps telling me we got to get the kids out of here. It's going to get us. And I didn't see anything. So I looked again, and all of a sudden I saw this real bright light. And I still didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't know what had scared him. But after looking at the way he was and looking at what I saw, I knew I better listen to him. So I went down the hallway and grabbed my daughter. And I came back to the hallway and went out the front door, and he had grabbed our son by then. And he got to the front door, and I heard him, he hollered, "Oh my God, it's going to see us." The power came back on, and apparently the TV set came back on. Here, he's screaming it's going to get us, and he starts to pick up, and he backs up, and when he puts it in reverse, the lights come on, the backup lights. And he's screaming again, "Oh my God, it's going to see us." So he took off down the road, no headlights on. And the light, I don't know whether it was from the moon or whether it was from this thing or what it was, but it was, I mean, you could see where you're going without the headlights on. But still, it scared him. He had the pickup going as fast as it could go. So we got to the railroad tracks, and he's screaming, "I got to get to Les's house." Les and Gail Aaron are friends of ours who, I don't know, maybe because they're the closest friends on that road, but he squealed in their driveway. And Gail was up. She told us later the power had gone off and her air conditioner was off.
Gail Aaron, the Pecha's neighbor, picks up the story.
Our puppy was new, and we'd only had him a couple of days, and he was crying, so I got up to feed him. And when I got up, then I noticed our clock was out. We have a clock radio. And then I tried all the lights, and they were all out. And I glanced out the windows and noticed everything was really dark. And about the time I'd, got back in the kitchen, then I heard this pickup driving very fast. And I thought it was just some kid fooling around like they usually do.
But Gail discovered she was wrong when she answered a knock on her front door.
Bill Pecha was at the door and yelling to me to look up in the sky. And he was kind of hysterical. Anyway, I looked up in the sky, and there was this large object, round, reminded me of a cup and saucer, with the cup upside down, going through the sky, very bright light on the bottom. The whole top of it was, you couldn't see anything inside, but you could see the outline of the whole object. And it was going through the sky. Not really, it didn't seem to be going really fast. After a while, it just started straight up in the air.
Both couples watched the huge object for some time, until it finally left, moving across the town of Colusa and then disappearing at a tremendous rate of speed. The electric power had been off for 9 minutes in Colusa and 2 other nearby areas that evening, and local utilities have still not been able to explain why. Close encounters of the second kind have drawn greater scientific interest simply because investigators have more to work with than just the testimony of witnesses. Again, Dr. Hynek.
Close encounters of the second kind were those in which there were some definite physical traces. In fact, we called them physical trace cases. The UFO, in those cases, interacted with the environment, either animate or inanimate, affecting animals, affecting machines and electrical circuits and so forth, and also affecting the ground. For instance, leaving burnt marks on the ground, holes in the ground, broken tree branches. In other words, physical effects that were directly associated with the reported craft.
Ted Phillips is a veteran UFO investigator who specializes in sightings where some physical trace of the incident is left. Close encounters of the second kind.
I think the physical trace landing cases give us the most direct approach to resolving the UFO problem, without question. Because we've compiled aerial observation, visual observations for 30 years. And they don't tell us that much. I mean, they tell us what the UFO looks like, how it acts at various speeds, colors, and so on. But what we need is something we can take into a laboratory.
One of Phillips' most interesting cases occurred on June 28, 1973, outside Columbia, Missouri. Just after midnight, James Richards, an employee of the University of Missouri, and his 16-year-old daughter, Ann, were preparing for bed in their trailer home on an isolated country road. Richards' 3-year-old son, Jamie, woke up and began to cry. The events that followed so frightened the Richards that Ann still refuses to discuss them. But James Richards remembers.
My daughter was going to the icebox refrigerator to get some milk for the baby. And she notices 2 bright lights, like spotlights. And then they converge into one big round ball, illuminate the whole area. With the trees swaying and well, it almost blinded me because I couldn't look directly because it was too bright, like an eclipse. That's what I took it to see. So I looked at it on an angle, you might say, you see. And then, too, the trees were swaying. And then we heard outside this thrashing going around the tree. And so I got kind of shook, naturally. So I went and got my guns. I loaded them, and my daughter went and ran, locked the door. Something did snap in my mind, though, not to shoot. Because it's a rule, anytime I heard anything outside at night, the first thing I would do is get my flashlight and a gun. I don't care what it is. I'll go outside and start searching. But something clicked in my mind and said, don't go outside. Don't go outside. And I just left the guns there on top of the deep freeze and just looked out the window and just observed the best I could. You have to see it yourself to really have an idea what I'm talking about. Because nothing I know of turns its colors, all different colors, beautiful colors, and do a 90-degree angle without making a sound, and hover there in space. And you sit there and look and all, you know. Oh, I said, my, it's pretty. But yet and still you was frightened because you were dealing with something that you never seen before. You had no idea. You see, you didn't know what it was going to do any harm or what.
Members of the Richards family weren't the only ones affected by the presence of the strange craft.
I have a doghouse out there on that side. And them dogs scurry up under the building and stay till the whole event was over. They didn't bark at all. No, sirree.
With a feeling of relief, Richards watched as the light dimmed somewhat and began to ease away. But suddenly, it made a sharp turn and approached the trailer again.
When it came back up the second time, I felt like death was at hand. I figured this was it. And as soon as it touched down, then the whole area just lit up. See, you was actually blind, you see, but you could hear the thrash and the walk around this particular tree. Just this one tree now. Then my daughter said, look at the tree, just pulling on the tree, and then the next thing, you heard the tree snap, that limb snap. And I tried to call for help. This time my lights went completely out and came back on. She couldn't call out. The telephone line was dead. You didn't hear a buzz tone or anything. Couldn't nobody call in, I couldn't call out, just complete like your wires were cut until they left.
In the course of his investigation of the Richards case, Ted Phillips spoke with the telephone operator who had traced the aborted emergency call.
I talked to the operator, contacted by the directory assistance operator, and she had been trying for 3 minutes to call Richards, but the line was indeed dead. Finally, suddenly, after she had tried 5 times, she broke through, and he was on the line. Well, when the police arrived, it was a young officer by himself. Richards told him what had happened, and he said the officer didn't seem to be too excited about going out into this darkened area. So they took a flashlight, they went over the fence, and sure enough, they found some imprints, which are about 5 inches long, about 3 inches wide, and about 2 to 2.5 inches into the ground. Now, I have to point out that the next day, a newspaper reporter was out there. He picked it up from the police blotter. And this reporter weighs about 350 pounds. And he could barely make a heel mark in the ground. It was that dry, that hard. So we're talking about considerable weight. At the site, then, I found this pattern of imprints down through there. The tree limb, which was twisted and pulled down, stripped down at a point 12.5 feet above the ground. And several other broken limbs. We arrived there a week after the event, and leaves were absolutely burnt, very badly burnt, down in the lower regions where the UFO had been. And leaves on the limbs some 40, 45 feet up in the air above this area were starting to die.
That big tree is completely dead today. The Richards have since moved to a new home surrounded by plenty of neighbors. But their hope of finding an answer for what they saw that night in June remains empty. The most intriguing types of UFO experiences, called Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Dr. Hynek, are those involving contact with humanoid occupants.
Close encounters of the third kind are those in which creatures, entities, beings, humanoids, UFOnauts, call them what you will, were reported in direct association with the sighted craft.
Just after sunset on the evening of November 5th, 1975, a 7-man crew was piling into a 4-wheel drive vehicle after finishing a day of woodcutting near the tiny northern Arizona community of Snowflake. One of the 7 men was Travis Walton, whose curiosity that night plunged him into a living nightmare he would never forget. Just before leaving the work area, The men in the Jeep watched a glowing object emerge from behind the trees. Travis opened a door to get a better view and continued watching, stunned with his companions.
The thing was about 90 feet away, about 20 feet in diameter, about 8 feet high. It was glowing a golden color, kind of like molten metal. I couldn't hear anything at first. It must have been because when I got closer I could hear it, but it was a high-pitched intermittent sound and a low rumbling sound. It sounded like machinery or, a heavy mechanical sound. Very difficult to describe.
Travis got out of the vehicle and moved toward the object, despite cries from his friends for him to return. Walton assumed by the time he could get any closer, the object would be gone.
Just as I got up close, it started to move with a sort of a rocking motion, kind of like a spinning top, like when it's slowing down to fall over, except it wasn't spinning. The same side stayed toward me. And when it started to move, it got real loud, and that really scared me. And I jumped down behind a log, and I looked up at this thing, and I decided then I was in a lot of danger, and I was going to get the heck out of there. And I raised up to go. It's the last thing I remember. I raised up and I started to turn, and I was just about in a high crouch when wham, I felt a numbing shock hit me. It kind of like in the head, and I went out. I was knocked unconscious.
His 6 co-workers, however, saw what Travis had not. A slender beam of intense light which shot from the craft and lifted Walton off his feet, knocking him to the ground. The rest of the crew sped away in panic, looking back to see the craft take off. But when they returned to see if Travis was all right, he was nowhere to be found. When Travis finally came to, he was weak, groggy, and in pain. Above him was a light. He assumed he was in a hospital bed, but as his blurred vision became clearer, he discovered he was wrong.
I felt something pressing on my chest. My shirt and my jacket were pushed up, and there was this thing laying across it. It was about 4 or 5 inches thick. The thing extended down over my rib cage and down to my belt. And when I looked up and I saw this thing, it was gray. And I looked past the edge of it, and I saw something white. My eyes weren't focusing real good, and at first I thought it was a doctor, white mask and cap. But when I got to where I could see, I saw this thing, and I just came unglued. I looked around me, and there was 3 of them. I just panicked. I became hysterical.
As his eyes became accustomed to the surroundings, Travis saw his captors in more detail.
They were about 4 feet 10. Had very large heads. No hair on their heads. No eyebrows. No whiskers or anything like that. They had very large eyes. Those eyes are something that really bothered me worse than anything. The rest of their features were small. It was like small ears, small nose, small mouth, hardly any lips if they had any lips. I never saw them open their mouth. But they were wearing a long coverall type things. They were orangish tan. When I saw them, I struck out. I wasn't really a blow. I was so weak. I pushed this one on my right, and he fell back into another one. They felt kind of marshmallowy, kind of like fat, Whereas, when you push against somebody with muscle, it feels differently. But they seemed light, unexpectedly. And I jumped off the table there and staggered over into the corner. There was a bench across the wall, and I leaned there. I was really weak, and I was so scared, I was shaking, and they started towards me. And I started just screaming at them, telling them to keep away from me. And I reached over and I grabbed a thing off of the table. There was a bunch of things there, and there was a clear tube about maybe 1 inch in diameter, I don't know, 1.5 feet long. And I thought, it wasn't heavy like glass, and it was too light for a club, so I wanted to defend myself. And And so I hit it against the table to break it, maybe get a sharp point, but it didn't break. But I lashed out at them with it, and I kept screaming. They only took a couple of steps, and they stopped.
After the creatures departed, Travis left the room through the same door, but went down the hallway in the opposite direction.
I came to a doorway on my right, and I went into this. I didn't go right in. I looked in, and it was a round room, a domed room, with a chair in the middle. And it was really funny about this room. It's really strange. It looked like, I could see the walls and everything, the same as everything else in that place. It was all just this matte gray metal look. But when I went towards the chair, I didn't go towards the chair right away. I walked around towards the side because the chair was high-backed, and I was afraid that there might be one of those things sitting in that chair. So I went around there, and when I could see that there was nobody in the chair, I walked over to it. But the closer I got to the chair, the darker the room seemed. And I could start seeing points of light, like the stars. There was buttons there. I did a stupid thing. I pushed some, hoping to open the door or something. But when that didn't work, well, I got scared of doing that too, because it made the stars move. I turned, and there was a man standing in the doorway I came through. And this guy, he appeared human to me, which was a big relief. And I ran up there and started asking him all kinds of questions. And he just smiled, kind of tolerant-like. And I assumed that maybe he couldn't hear me because he had the helmet on his head. He had a clear helmet. And so when he motioned for me, and he took me by the arm, I went with him. I assumed I was being rescued.
Travis was led out of the craft and into a large hangar, where more human-like figures were present. He remembers their appearance this way.
They'd pass, on the street, but they had a strange thing to their eyes. They were a light color, a golden hazel, and they had a resemblance to each other, like a family, but not identical. There was one of them that was a woman, I could tell. Had longer hair and female shape. One of the men and the woman came over there, and they put me on the table, and they put a mask over my face, and I started to resist, and they held me on the table, and they put this mask on my face, and I reached up to pull it away, and before I could, everything went black.
Meanwhile, the other members of the woodcutting crew had reported Walton missing. Local police organized a search party, but no trace of Walton was found. The next thing he remembered, Travis was lying on the side of a road outside Heber, Arizona, 12 miles from Snowflake.
When I first regained consciousness, I was laying on the roadway, to the side of the road, more off than on. And my head was on my arm, and I saw a light, and I looked up in time to see it go off, which I think was either a light going off or a hatch closing, perhaps. Then I saw this object hovering there. It was a flattened sphere. It was shaped like a disc, but it was very shiny, chrome-like. I could see that reflecting everything around there, but not giving off any light. It was dark. And it was just there for a second, hovering about 4 feet off the ground, and then it just shot straight up. It was incredible how quick, without making a sound.
Travis staggered to a phone booth to call his family, who at first did not believe it was really him. But once convinced, they came to take him home. On the way, Travis received yet another shock.
We were riding back in, and they said something about everybody being worried about me. I can't remember the exact conversation, but I said, well, it must have been a bad couple of hours or something, to reference the time or something like that. And they said, Travis, you've been gone for 5 days.
While recuperating, Travis was able to remember most of what had happened to him. A series of hypnotic regressions with Dr. James Harder from the University of California, however, enabled Walton to recall things with less anxiety and more detail. What you are about to hear is a rare edited portion of one of those hypnotic sessions, in which Travis Walton offers a chilling recollection of his face-to-face encounter with his abductors.
You can describe what he looks like to us, and it won't bother you. It's just like you were trying to describe something for someone who was going to draw something. He's ugly. You can describe what he looks like to us and it won't bother you. He looks so white. He looks soft. Rubbery. He looks Chinese. Did you get a picture of what the eyes look like? He looked at me. I look at his eyes. They're big, round eyes. They move. Can you see what color they might be? Brown. Brownish. Take a good look at the pupil. Can you tell me what the pupil looks like? Only horses have eyes like that.
Because of its sensational nature, UFO debunkers have singled out the Travis Walton case for criticism. They have accused him of everything from describing an LSD trip to telling an outright lie. In an attempt to resolve the controversy, investigative research associates sought the expertise of former military intelligence officer Charles R. McQuiston. During World War II, McQuiston and a fellow officer developed a prototype of a revolutionary new truth test called Psychological Stress Evaluation, or PSE. The PSE instrument measures tiny nerve impulses from the brain, which are transmitted to a person's vocal cords. Using a tape recorder at slow speed, a moving needle translates the voice impulses onto a narrow strip of paper, similar to a lie detector or a hospital electrocardiogram. Police departments in several states are using PSE instead of traditional lie detectors, which many times register artificial stress due to anxiety produced by the test itself. Charles McQuiston discusses the result of his PSE evaluation of Travis Walton.
I have run the subject Walton on some 30 charts to ascertain certain basic things. Number one, I think the prime consideration is any possibility of a hoax on the part of Walton in the story that he is telling. I have noticed several indications of what may well be embellishment of facts on the part of the subject, but in no way do they interfere with my impression that he really believes what he is saying. I think that it's a simple case of the story having been retold many times, and it has been polished as it has been told. In other words, I think he's trying to be as accurate as he can, but he is putting in words that would not necessarily have been there the first time that he told the story. He is under varying degrees of stress, ranging from extreme stress almost to the panic point in describing certain traumatic elements of this experience, and I don't think this would be possible if it was any kind of a hoax being perpetrated on his part. Whether, in fact, it happened at all, or to the degree that he says it did, is really irrelevant in terms of this instrumentation, because I can only tell you whether or not he really believes what he's saying, and I believe that he does, that he is sincere.
Dr. Hynek summarizes the Walton controversy.
I've always divided the Travis Walton case, in my own mind, into two parts. The first, which involved 6 witnesses who were given lie detector tests, 5 of whom completed it successfully, and the 6th was inconclusive but not negative. That part of the story fits a very definite pattern. The sighting of a brilliantly illuminated object which was hovering not too far from the ground. All of that fits. The second part, the actual abduction of Travis Walton, of course, we have only his word for this, but the story does hang together, and it is unusual in that the time lapse was so long, 5 days, whereas in most of the abduction cases, the time lapse and the time aboard, so to speak, is a matter of minutes or hours. Further, the rigorous analysis given the psychological stress evaluation test by Mr. McQuiston seems to indicate that Walton is indeed telling the truth.